The Russian steamroller was meant to run right over Ukraine, leaving Putin and his Kremlin cronies in a position to project power over an unready Europe, but that didn't happen. What was meant to be a flash invasion has just exposed Russia as the worst modern military of the past century. Putin's war in Ukraine is exploding as we speak, and we all are bearing witness to what a total military collapse looks like. And the evidence of that comes from a recent report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, which has pointed out that Russia's gains in Ukraine are so pathetic that the modern military world hasn't seen anything like it since World War I. Every war since has seen faster advances than Russia is achieving in Ukraine, and even some of the bloodiest battles of World War I resulted in a faster rate of advance than what Russia is achieving. As Putin's soldiers fight against waves of drones, battering artillery, and a Ukrainian defense that seems to have the ability to adapt to anything that Russia throws at it, one headline figure stands out. Russia advances at a rate of between 15 and 70 meters, or about 49.2 and 229.6 feet per day. You might travel about that far to reach the sidewalk from your own house, which shows us that Russia's forces are crawling, rather than steamrolling their way to, well, not victory. Inevitable and devastating defeat seems more accurate. Russia is paying a massive price for these paltry gains, as you'll discover if you keep watching this video. However, before we delve into that, it's worth examining the CSIS report and its implications for the rate of Russia's advance and the territory it is actually capturing. The last 2 years in particular have been bleak for Russia on the advancement front. After the fall of Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast, which occurred in February 2024, Russia believed it had all the momentum and would sweep through Donetsk at will. All that stood in its way was the city, 320 of Pokrovsk, which had become established as Ukraine's key logistical and transportation hub in Donetsk. And across the entire eastern front, all Russia would have to do was attrit the target. Pokrovsk was battered almost from the moment that Avdiivka fell. Glide bombs flew into the city constantly, ravaging its buildings and destroying any hint of the impressive settlement that it had once been. Russia deployed drones, both long-range and FPV, to draw its troops closer to Pokrovsk. And once those soldiers were within touching distance of the city, artillery shelling began alongside infantry assaults. It's the standard Russian tactic. Overwhelm an enemy with equipment and manpower, and Russia will win in the end. Only Russia hasn't won. As CSIS notes, Russia has only managed to advance just under 50 kilometers, or about 31 miles, in the Pokrovsk direction since the fall of Avdiivka in January 2026. That adds up to the glacial pace of 70 meters per day that we mentioned earlier, and it means that it has taken Russia almost 2 years to gain partial control over Pokrovsk. And we say partial because Ukraine is still defending the northern part of the city, so it could be many weeks or even months before Pokrovsk finally breaks, assuming it breaks at all. This Russian failure to capture key cities and settlements isn't limited to Pokrovsk. Take the settlement of Chasiv Yar, for instance. Much smaller than Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar is another of Ukraine's defensive nodes. Russia turned its sights onto the settlement in February 2024, after claiming Bakhmut the previous May, and it has even claimed to have captured the settlement as recently as July 2025. But Ukraine was still fighting when that claim was made. It is still fighting now. And Russia's rate of advance in the Chasiv Yar direction is even slower than in Pokrovsk. In its report on the CSS article, United 24 Media says that Russian forces have advanced about 10 kilometers, or around 6.2 miles in their 22 years of attempting to take Chasiv Yar, and that rate of advance gives us the lower end of the daily estimates that we highlighted as the headline figure earlier, just 15 meters per day, everywhere you look across the portions of the combat lines where Russia is actively trying to advance as quickly as it can. You see this kind of failure. In the Kupiansk sector, which is in Kharkiv, Russia has managed to push forward just 9.5 kilometers, or about 5.9 miles, since mid-November 2024, amounting to an average daily advance of just 23 meters, or a little over 75 feet. Russia has claimed that it captured Kupiansk, by the way. There's a reason why, as there was for the claimed capture of Chasiv Yar. that we'll reveal later in the video. The only bright spot for Russia is that it has managed to move quickly. In its attempts to take the city of Huliaipol, which is in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, there Russia's forces have managed to advance 18.5 kilometers, or around 11.5 miles, at a rate of 297 meters, or about 974 feet per day. But after seeing what's happening elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia will have to be wondering how long it can keep that sort of pace up in the Huliaipol sector before Ukraine starts mounting the kind of defense seen in the other three regions that we've mentioned. Now let's get to the really interesting numbers. How Russia's rate of advance compares to what we've seen in other wars and battles over the past century. As we mentioned earlier, the ongoing Russian offensives, outside of that in the Huliaipol sector, are achieving a rate of advance of just 15 to 70 meters per day, depending on the sector. That's worse than the rate seen during the grinding and terrible Battle of the Somme, which at least saw the combined UK and French troops advance 80 meters, or about 262 feet daily. That battle was one of the bloodiest during the entire World War I, to the point where the UK sustained 57,000 casualties in one day on July 1st, 1916. Things haven't gotten that bad for Russia, but its crawling advance is officially worse than the warfare rules, and soldiers died in droves. One scene in a battle where Trench trying to make it across no man's land. Russia itself advanced a lot faster following the siege of Leningrad during World War II, hitting a daily rate of about a kilometer, or 0.62 miles, CSIS claims. In the Battle of Galicia during World War I, Russia managed to hit a rate of advance of 1.58 kilometers, or a little under a mile per day. Again, these were grinding battles with enormous casualty rates, and Russia is moving far slower than the troops in any of them. But here's the kicker: a fresh batch of eggs to Putin's face. When Ukraine counter-invaded the Russian oblast of Kursk, its soldiers managed to advance at a rate of 1.25 kilometers, or about 0.77 miles daily. That's faster than Russia has advanced across any major front in Ukraine, outside of the initial days of the invasion when it took large swaths of territory in Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk, among other regions. Ever since then, Russia has been crawling toward its target. A giant military turtle is as useless as the tanks that bear the same name, which are loaded with a mishmash of defenses in a desperate attempt to protect them from Ukraine's drones. Those turtle tanks rarely get anywhere, and it looks like the same can be said for Russia's advancing forces. Taking a wider view, CSIS reports that Russia has managed to fully seize around 75,000 square kilometers, or about 28,950 square miles, of Ukraine since Putin began his bloody invasion in February 2022. In terms of occupation and control, the number is a little higher, 120,000 square kilometers, or a little over 46,300 square miles, which is roughly 20% of Ukraine. However, this territory includes the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014, along with the small parts of the Donbass region that it occupied during that period. What seems like an impressive figure at first glance is made less so when you take the total amount of territory that Russia has captured over the last 2 years into account. In 2024, Russia occupied just 3,604 square kilometers, or 1,391 square miles of Ukraine. In 2025, the number was higher, at 4,031 square kilometers, or 1,865 square miles. But that was what Russia gained in return for a massive summer offensive that was supposed to put the finishing touches on a war that shows no sign of ending. We said earlier in the video that we are seeing what a military collapse looks like. These pathetic gains, relative to the sheer size and supposed strength of Russia's military, show that Putin's forces are utterly incapable of making any sort of real gains. And those they are making, as meager as they may be, are coming at a price that Russia can't afford to absorb for much longer. That price alone changes everything for Putin. But before we get to that, you're watching The Military Show, and now is the perfect time to subscribe to ensure you don't miss videos like this in the future. Russia's slow rate of advance might be excusable if Putin were ordering his forces to hang back and only attack Ukraine when appropriate opportunities presented themselves. At least then, Russia would still be a turtle, but it might just be like the turtle in the famous fable. Slow and steady wins the race, the theory would go. But you already know what we're going to say. There is nothing considered or careful about the strategy that Russia is employing in Ukraine. Russia has lost soldiers at a rate that nobody could have ever expected when Putin launched his invasion. CSIS estimates that Russia has lost 1.2 million soldiers to death, injury, capture, or simply going missing since February 2022. This is roughly in line with the estimates provided by Ukraine's own Ministry of Finance, which puts the number at roughly 1.236 million Russian soldiers. 2025 was a particularly damaging year for Russia, as CSIS reports that it lost 415,000 soldiers, creating a monthly casualty rate of 35,000. The picture might be even grimmer than that for Russia, especially after what Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, reported toward the end of the year. Zelensky said that Ukraine scored 35,000 eliminations, not casualties, of Russia's forces in December 2025. Add other casualties to that figure, and you get a monthly rate far larger than the CSIS estimate, and a rate that could easily see Russia's casualties top 500,000 in 2026, assuming Ukraine can keep up its defense. We'll let CSIS put this into context. No major power has suffered anywhere near these numbers of casualties or fatalities in any war since World War II. CSIS proclaims, adding what, for example, U.S. battlefield casualty and fatality numbers are significantly lower, with the United States suffering 54,087 battle deaths during the Korean War, 47,434 deaths during the Vietnam War, and 49 deaths during the 1990-1991-20 Gulf War, 2,465 deaths in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Freedom Sentinel, and 4,432 deaths in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Disregarding the success or otherwise of these campaigns, Russia is getting to a point where it could feasibly lose every month the same number of soldiers that the U.S. lost during the entire Korean War. Putin's Ukraine track record doesn't compare favorably to Russia's military exploits since World War II either. Right now, CSIS's estimated Russian battlefield fatalities of between 275,000 and 325,000 are 11 times greater than those seen during both of the Chechen wars that occurred during the 1990s and the 2000s, and 17 times greater than the former Soviet Union saw in Afghanistan during the 1980s. It's almost like Putin is trying to set some kind of record, and the award for slowest gains at the highest possible cost goes to Russia. Compounding all of this for Russia is that it's now getting anywhere close to inflicting the types of casualties that Ukraine is inflicting on Putin's forces. That seems like an obvious statement to make, as a slow rate of advance naturally means that Russia can't be eliminating many Ukrainian soldiers. Still, the ratios make for interesting reading. According to CSIS, Ukraine has likely suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties since February 2022, which is less than half of Russia's casualty count. These figures give us a ratio that is somewhere between 2 to 1 and 2.5 to 1 for Russian casualties compared to Ukrainian casualties. We've bombarded you with a ton of statistics so far in this video. Now, let's get into what all of this means for Russia in the context of 2026 and the future of the Ukraine war. The first thing is that we are seeing the impact of Russia's attritional strategy in action. Russia has always played to its numerical advantage in every war in which it has taken part. Putin is just following the old Soviet playbook of throwing warm bodies at a problem until that problem goes away. The soldiers, missiles, drones, artillery, glide bombs, tanks, and everything else that Russia uses in Ukraine are all intended to gradually wear away at Ukraine's defenses. In other words, Russia's rate of advance was never going to be rapid, but what we should have been seeing were periods where Russia got held up against Ukraine's fortifications, with those delays being compensated by fast advances once the Russian forces broke through. Of course, we haven't seen that happen. Instead, and as the Kyiv Post notes, Ukraine's defense has been so strong that even the few tactical adaptations that Russia has made to its attritional strategy haven't resulted in the types of breakthroughs that Putin needs. Ukraine's front line certainly isn't collapsing. Rather, every cycle of sending Russian soldiers and equipment into the meat grinder just means that the Russian front line is destroying itself. We see this in the substantial losses of Russian equipment that go along with the blood that Putin's war has spilled. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia's strategy has cost it over 11,600 tanks, more than 23,950 armored vehicles, around 36,730 artillery units, well over 118,000 drones, and many thousands more pieces of equipment. Basic logic tells us that these losses aren't sustainable, especially if Russia intends to make any actual breakthroughs. Assaults are getting weaker because Russia's armor is disappearing and its veterans are dying, only to be replaced by fresh recruits who die a lot faster. These aren't the only costs that Russia is enduring, but we'll come back to the second type of cost in a moment. Before that, let's return to something that we mentioned earlier in the video. We told you that there was a reason why Russia was claiming to have captured settlements where battles are clearly still raging. And that reason is that Russia is trying to position itself as the country that has all of the momentum in the Ukraine war. After all, a country that holds all of the cards is a country that gets a better deal out of the peace negotiations that have been ongoing between Ukraine and Russia for about a year. The New Voice of Ukraine pointed this out when reporting on Russia's false claim to have captured Kupiansk. It highlighted a report by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which said that the Kremlin was trying to create an alternative reality in the Ukraine war that it could use to pressure the U.S. into favoring Russia in peace talks. Again, it's simple logic. If Russia can convince the right people that city after city is falling to its might, it can also convince those people to push Ukraine to cede occupied territories to end the war. All of the CSIS figures that we've shared in this video shatter the smokescreen that Russia has tried to create. But if you think that is going to stop Russia from spreading its falsehoods, you are sadly mistaken. Putin has never let something so minor as the truth get in the way of what he wants, which means that Russia is still making claims that it can't back up. On January 27th, Russia's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, made the claim that Russia had captured the settlement of Kupiansk, Fuzlovy in the Kharkiv region. It hasn't. Russia's forces are still at least 10 kilometers, or around 6.2 miles, away from that particular settlement, according to the New Voice of Ukraine. The same general also claimed, on the same day, that Russia's forces are advancing in virtually all directions. Gerasimov said that Russia has seized 17 Ukrainian settlements and about 500 square kilometers